The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a familiar backdrop to countless hours spent within the hospital's walls. I'd always believed that doctors, particularly those of us in our late 20s, were creatures of routine, focused on medical journals and patient charts, with little room for the unexpected, especially not of the romantic or intimate kind. The colleagues I knew, often driven and meticulous, seemed to navigate life with precision, charting a course toward their next certification or research grant. Then, at 28, I met a young patient named Alex, and that belief was irrevocably shattered with every stolen glance, every unspoken word that shimmered between us, a palpable tension humming beneath the surface. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the oncology wing, the soft glow of the recessed lighting casting long, gentle shadows. The ward was mostly quiet, a stark contrast to the bustling emergency room I often frequented. Everything about Alex seemed raw, almost fragile, his pale skin contrasting with the dark circles under his eyes, but his gaze was intense, holding a depth that belied his 18 years. He'd been admitted just a few hours prior, and I remember feeling a tug, a connection I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the detached clinical observation I was used to, but something more, something akin to recognition. He was tracing the lines of his foredrip, a slight frown creasing his brow, when our eyes met. The connection was fleeting, yet it held a charge that was anything but clinical. It was as if an unspoken acknowledgement passed between us. His lips curved into a soft, almost hesitant smile that lingered for a moment longer than what doctor-patient protocol dictated. At first, I tried to brush it off, attributing it to the vulnerability of his situation, but something about the way his gaze locked with mine, the soft light playing on his lips, stuck with me. It wasn't just a casual glance, it was a spark, a silent question I found myself desperate to answer. For the next hour, I found myself stealing glances in his direction. Sometimes he was speaking softly with his nurse, other times he was staring absently out the window, his movements both graceful and hesitant. The longer I observed him, the more I was drawn to his quiet resilience. There was something deeply alluring about his guarded demeanor and the subtle intensity he carried. As the afternoon faded, casting the room in soft, muted tones, I found myself near his bedside, checking his charts. For a moment, his eyes met mine again, and there was that familiar flicker of something, a shared understanding, a silent plea. Instead of looking away, I decided to act. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice breaking the quiet of the room. He hesitated before turning towards me, a hint of surprise in his expression. "Yeah, I think so," he said, his voice low and a little rough. "You seem uncomfortable," I said, my voice a little too gentle, my cheeks flushing. He smiled, a real smile that lit up his eyes. "I'm just not a big fan of hospitals," he replied, his tone teasing but warm. "Well," I said, "I could bring some extra blankets if you want." He laughed softly, the sound light and genuine. "I wouldn't say no to that," he said. Our fingers brushed as I adjusted his sheets, a small spark seeming to jump between us. He hesitated before leaning back against the pillow, a lingering glance that spoke volumes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was charged, like we both knew there was more to this than a simple exchange. Finally, I broke the quiet. "Long day," I said, nodding towards the window. He chuckled, a low sound that was laced with a hint of exhaustion. "It is," he agreed, "but the nurses have been mostly kind." "I try to be," I said, a smile playing on my lips. "You are," he said, his eyes searching mine. "You're the first doctor who has looked at me like I'm a person, not just a patient." His words hung in the air, heavy and unfiltered. I wasn't sure what to say, so I stayed quiet, letting him continue if he wanted. "I've been here a few times," he added after a moment, "and sometimes, it all starts to feel the same." "I think everyone feels that way at some point," I said finally, my voice soft. "We get so caught up in what we do that we forget to ask what we really want." Alex turned to look at me, his eyes searching mine. For a moment, I wondered if I'd said too much, but then he nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're perceptive for someone so clinical," he said, his tone teasing but warm. I laughed lightly, shaking my head. "Or maybe I just see what you're projecting." That made him laugh, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to fill the room. It was the first time I'd seen him let go of the weight he carried, even if only for a moment. It felt like a small victory. As the afternoon wore on, we spoke, or rather, we found reasons to be near one another, lingering by his bedside or near the nurse's station. We talked about everything and nothing, his love for art, my fascination with medical history, the books we were reading, and our dreams for the future. The more we talked, the more I realized how much I enjoyed his company. There was something comforting about his presence, like a calm in the middle of a storm. Eventually, the conversation slowed, and we sat in companionable silence, watching the pale light fade. I could feel his gaze shift to me every now and then, but I didn't turn to meet it, not yet. There was something unspoken in the air between us, something fragile and undefined, and I wasn't ready to break it. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a long time since I felt this, seen," he said, his words catching me off guard. I turned to look at him, his expression open, vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. "You don't have to thank me," I said softly. "I'm glad you're here." For a moment, we just looked at each other, the quiet intimacy of the moment settling around us. It wasn't a grand gesture or a sudden revelation. It was a connection, simple and profound, that neither of us had anticipated. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something neither of us fully understood yet. The hours after that first conversation felt different. There was a new layer to my routine. I'd find myself looking around for Alex more often, hoping to catch a glimpse of him in his bed or near the hallway. When our eyes inevitably met, it felt like an unspoken invitation. It didn't take long for these glances to become more intense. A nod from him, or a subtle lean in my direction, was all it took, and I'd find myself drawn to his quiet presence. There was a rhythm to our interactions, a flow that made the hours slip by unnoticed. He spoke with a soft confidence, his words measured but meaningful. I began to understand the depth of his thoughts, the way he carried his youth and his illness with a mixture of pride and quiet resilience. One evening, as the shift was winding down, Alex asked if I could stay a little longer. "I realize you've probably got other things to do," he said with a smile, "but it gets lonely here." I hesitated, surprised by the sudden invitation, but his easy demeanor put me at ease. "Sure," I said, pulling a chair closer to his bedside. The room was quieter than usual, the hum of the hospital equipment a soft lullaby in the background. The air was warm and still, a faint scent of antiseptic lingering around us, mixing with the faint traces of his cologne. It felt intimate, comfortable, a stark contrast to the often sterile atmosphere of the hospital. "You know," he began, his voice low, "I wasn't sure about you at first." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You're observant, and you're quiet. Most people don't bother looking past the surface." His words caught me off guard, and I found myself searching for a response. "Maybe I just know what it's like to feel unseen," I said quietly. "It makes you notice things in others." Alex's gaze softened, his expression thoughtful. "You're a good listener," he said. "It's rare to find someone who listens without trying to fix or judge." There was a weight to his words, a sincerity that made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure where this was going, but something in his eyes told me he wanted something from me. "I think sometimes people just need to be heard," I said simply. He nodded, his eyes distant for a moment before returning to mine. "You're right. And it's been a long time since I felt heard." The vulnerability in his voice was palpable, and it tugged at something deep within me. I wanted to tell him that he deserved to be heard, that his thoughts and feelings mattered, but the words felt too heavy to say aloud. Instead, I offered him a small smile, letting the silence fill the space between us. As the night wore on, our conversation drifted to more personal topics. He shared stories of his passion for art, his dreams of traveling the world, the challenges his illness imposed. I shared bits of my life, too, how I had entered medicine, my loneliness, and my own struggles with finding my place in the world. The more we talked, the more I realized that we had more in common than I had first anticipated. At one point, he leaned back against his pillow, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "It's funny," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia, "when you're young, you think the world is your oyster, but life hits you, and you don't know what to do next." I nodded, understanding the sentiment, even though my experience was so different from his. "Do you ever feel like you've missed something?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He considered this for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. Regret doesn't change the past." His honesty was disarming, and I felt a sudden urge to share something of my own. "I think everyone has those moments," I said. "I'm only 28, and I already catch myself wondering if I'm on the right path." Alex looked at me, his expression soft but serious. "You've got time," he said. "More than you realize. Don't let fear stop you from living." His words stayed with me long after he drifted off to sleep. There was a wisdom in them, a perspective I hadn't considered before. There was something still coming, I could feel it. The way he had looked at me, the way he had spoken to me, it was as if he desired me, and it drove me crazy, as something in me desired him too. As I sat there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that Alex and I had crossed an invisible line. It wasn't just about casual conversations, there was a connection between us, something unspoken but undeniable. Over the next hour, I found myself drawn to him even more. I'd catch glimpses of him when I checked his chart, and my heart would quicken in a way I couldn't explain. There was a warmth in his presence, a comfort that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't before. As much as I tried to tell myself that it was just a friendly connection, a part of me wondered if it was something more. One evening, as the shift was winding down, I found myself back at his bedside, another chart in hand. The air was warm and still, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering around us. We sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the pale light fade. Finally, Alex spoke, his voice low and measured. "You know," he said, "I never thought I'd find myself here, sharing feelings with a doctor. But it's nice." I offered, the sincerity in his words warming me more than the coffee I had been drinking. "Yeah, it's nice," he admitted. "It's easy to talk to you." He turned to look at me, his gaze lingering for a moment. I thought he might say something more, but he simply nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was charged, as though we were both waiting for something neither of us could name. In that quiet moment, beneath the fading light, I realized just how much Alex had come to mean to me. He was not just a patient, he was so much more. I was attracted to him, and I wasn't sure yet, but I think he was attracted to me, too. The time that followed felt like a slow dance between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Alex and I fell into a rhythm, as if our lives had always been intertwined this way. Our casual conversation turned into longer moments together, and soon it became natural for me to be seeking him out. Each time I stepped into his room, it felt like entering a world set apart from everything else, a quiet refuge where time seemed to slow down. Alex's presence was magnetic. He didn't need to command attention with grand gestures or flashy words. It was in the small things, the way his voice softened when he spoke of his art, the way he leaned forward slightly when he listened, as though my words were the only ones that mattered. Eventually, he asked me to stay after my shift ended. "It's usually a bit quiet in the evening," he warned with a self-deprecating smile. "But it's always better with company." I laughed, taking in the sight of him. He wore a relaxed look, not just a patient's one. The air felt charged and completely disarming. "This is a very generous offer," I said, sitting down beside his bed. "I know," he replied, shrugging. The remark hung in the air, a quiet nod to the hours we had spent together. I wanted to understand more, but the vulnerability in his eyes held me back. As we sat there talking, the conversation flowed as easily as ever. He shared stories of his impulsive adventures, of nights spent under the stars. His voice carried a mix of nostalgia and longing, as though he were reliving those moments with every word. "I used to think those were the best days of my life," he said, his gaze drifting toward the window, "but now, I'm not so sure." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. He met my gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Back then, it was all about chasing the next thrill, the next high. But I think the best days are the ones where you're truly present, where you can sit across from someone and just feel at peace." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. "I get that," I said quietly. "It's not about the big moments, is it? It's about the little ones." "Exactly," he said, his lips curving into a soft smile. "And lately, it feels like there are more of those little moments." The words hung between us, their meaning unspoken but understood. My heart raced, and I felt a pull toward him that was as undeniable as it was unexpected. I wasn't sure if it was the end of a long day, or the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, but something in me shifted. The hospital quieted for the night, and the ward filled with the usual sounds of rest, but everything felt surreal. We remained in his room, a lingering sense of something special hanging in the air. "This has been different," Alex said, his voice low. "Thank you." "You don't have to thank me," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "You made it easy." He chuckled softly, the sound warm and genuine. "You make it easy, too." The moment stretched between us, the silence thick with unspoken emotions. I could feel the tension in the air, the magnetic pull that seemed to draw us closer with every passing second. Then, without thinking, I reached out, letting my fingers brush against his. His hand stilled under mine, and for a moment, I worried I'd crossed a line. But then, he turned his hand over, his palm meeting mine, his fingers curling gently around mine. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I felt my breath hitch. "Alex," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything." His words were both a reassurance and an invitation, and I felt my resolve crumble. The space between us seemed to shrink, and before I knew it, I was leaning closer, drawn to the warmth of his presence. When our lips finally met, it was tentative, a careful exploration of the emotions we had both been holding back. His touch was gentle but firm, his lack of experience evident in the way he moved, the way he held me, as if I was something precious. It wasn't rushed or frantic, it was steady, deliberate, and filled with a depth of feeling that left me breathless. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I didn't think this was possible," he admitted, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Neither did I said, my voice shaky but honest, "but I'm glad it is." For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at ease, as though I'd found a place where I belonged. As I sat there, wrapped in the quiet comfort of Alex's presence, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it with him. And I knew that this was not over, it was the beginning of something bigger than I could have ever imagined. The night carried a serene weight, as though the universe itself had paused to take a breath. Alex and I remained near his bed, the soft glow of the nightlight casting warm shadows on his face. His eyes lingered on mine, a mix of gratitude and trepidation swimming in their depths. I could sense the hesitation in him, the years of restraint and responsibility that threatened to pull him back. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, my hands still resting in his. He nodded, exhaling slowly. "I am," he admitted, "it's just, it's been a long time since I let myself feel this way." I smiled, understanding the courage it must have taken for him to admit that. "Me too," I said, though my experience with vulnerability paled in comparison to his, "but I think we deserve this, don't you?" Alex's lips curved into a faint smile, but the weight in his eyes remained. "I spent so many years convincing myself that there was only one way to live, that the roles we play, patient, roommate, define us entirely." But lately, he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the window, where the city lights shone. "Lately, I've been wondering what else there is." He turned back to me, his voice more certain now. "What it might mean to choose something for myself, to feel something just because I want to." His words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I squeezed his hand gently, anchoring him to the moment. "You can," I said simply, "and you don't have to apologize for it." He closed his eyes briefly, as though absorbing the truth of my words. When he opened them again, there was a quiet determination in his gaze. "You're something else," he said, his voice low and filled with a warmth that sent a shiver through me. We sat there for a while, the silence between us filled with the kind of understanding that didn't need words. I could feel the shift in him, the way his shoulders relaxed and his grip on my hand steadied. He wasn't fighting it anymore, he was allowing himself to be present, to let the moment unfold without resistance. Then, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the window, Alex's eyes took on a different kind of intensity. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you want to?" He hesitated, glancing toward the bathroom. I felt a jolt of adrenaline shoot through me. The idea was reckless, impulsive, but it was impossible to ignore the desire that was building between us. "Yes," I said, my voice just as low, "I do." He stood, tugging me gently by the hand. "Quickly," he said, leading me toward the small, private bathroom. My heart pounded as he pushed open the door. The space was small, the fluorescent light harsh, but in that moment, it felt like the only place in the world where we could truly exist. I turned, and Alex was there, his eyes dark with want. He didn't say anything, just reached for me, his hands cupping my face as he kissed me with a ferocity that matched my own. His tongue slipped between my lips, and I moaned into his mouth, my hands tangling in his hair. We fumbled in the narrow space, making everything feel more urgent. He pulled my shirt out of my trousers, his fingers brushing across my skin, sending shivers down my spine. I reached for his belt, and he groaned when I undid it, his eyes never leaving mine. The hospital shifted, and we steadied ourselves against the small sink. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his breath hot against my ear. "More than anything," I said, my voice thick with desire. We kissed again, a deep, hungry kiss that left us both breathless. He unzipped my trousers, and I did the same to his. The contact was electric, the small space amplifying every touch. I pulled him closer, and he wrapped his arms around me, holding me tight against his body. We moved together in a desperate rhythm that matched the throbbing in my chest. The small space seemed to disappear, and I was lost in the sensation of him, his skin hot against mine, his breath rasping in my ear. The moment built, a crescendo of sensation that left us both gasping for breath. As we reached the peak, I squeezed my eyes shut, letting go of everything but the moment. We stood there, panting, our bodies pressed together, the sounds of the hospital a distant hum. When we finally pulled apart, it was with a sense of disbelief. Alex started, his voice shaky. "Don't," I said, pressing a finger to his lips. "Just, don't." We stayed like that for a few minutes, the small space holding our secret. Then, with a last, lingering look, we straightened our clothes and stepped back into the real world. As we made our way back to his bed, I felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it with him. And I knew that this was not over, it was the beginning of something bigger than I could have ever imagined. The morning light filtered softly through the hospital's windows, casting a golden hue over the room. I woke to the quiet sounds of the hospital systems, my head resting against Alex's chest, his arms still draped around me. His breathing was deep and even, a peaceful rhythm that made the world feel safe. For a moment, I stayed perfectly still, savoring the tranquility of the moment. It felt like the kind of morning I'd always hoped for, simple, quiet, and filled with a sense of belonging. Eventually, Alex stirred, his eyes fluttering open as he looked down at me. A slow, warm smile spread across his face, and he gave a soft chuckle. "Good morning," he said, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Morning," I replied, feeling my cheeks warm under his gaze. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead. "I can't remember the last time I woke up feeling this content," he admitted, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "Me neither," I said, smiling back at him. "This feels right." "It does," he agreed, his expression softening more than I ever expected it would. We stayed like that for a while, the weight of the world kept at bay by the stillness of the moment. There was no rush, no need to fill the silence with words. Everything we needed to say was spoken in the way we held each other, in the way his hand absent-mindedly traced circles on my arm, in the way our breaths synchronized, as if our bodies had found their own rhythm together. Eventually, hunger began to creep in, and Alex reluctantly pulled away. "I think I owe you breakfast," he said with a grin, sitting up and stretching. "You don't owe me anything," I said, following him out into the hallway, "but I'm not going to say no to whatever they have in the cafeteria." He laughed, the sound light and free, as he rummaged through his cabinet. "How do you feel about hospital food?" "Perfect," I replied, taking a seat on one of the chairs as he worked. I watched him with a sense of quiet admiration. There was something grounding about the way he moved, his actions steady and purposeful. It reminded me of why I had been drawn to him in the first place, his quiet strength, his ability to make even the simplest moments feel meaningful. When he placed the small trays in front of me, the aroma was, well, it was hospital food, but it was good. "You've really outdone yourself," I said, taking a bite. The flavors were okay, just like the man who had made it. Alex smiled, sitting across from me. "I wanted to make this morning special," he said, his tone earnest. "You did," I assured him, "more than you know." After breakfast, we found ourselves back in the room, the weight of the previous night still hanging in the air, but in a way that felt comforting rather than heavy. Alex leaned back on his bed, his gaze distant for a moment before he spoke. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "For so long, I convinced myself that part of my life was over, that it wasn't something I could have anymore." I reached out, placing a hand on his knee. "You can," I said firmly, "and you deserve to." His eyes met mine, and there was a rawness there that made my chest tighten. "It's scary," he admitted, "letting myself feel this way, letting myself want this." "I know," I said softly, "but you're not doing it alone." He nodded, his expression softening. "I don't think I could have done this without you. You've made me realize that it's okay to want more, to want something for myself." I leaned in, resting my forehead against his. "And you've shown me what it means to truly connect with someone, to see them for who they are, not who they think they have to be." The moment lingered, the silence between us heavy with unspoken promises. When we finally pulled apart, it was with a sense of quiet resolution. This wasn't just a fleeting connection, it was the start of something that had the power to change us both. As the day wore on, we talked about the future, not in grand, sweeping terms, but in the small, meaningful ways that made all the difference. We spoke of shared meals outside the hospital, lazy evenings exploring the city, and the kind of companionship that made even the most ordinary moment feel extraordinary. By the time my shift ended, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known was possible. Alex sat beside me as I closed my chart, his hand in mine as we watched the world slow down around us. "You know," he said after a while, his voice soft, "I used to think my best days were behind me, but now, I'm starting to believe they might still be ahead." I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. They are, I said confidently, and I'll be right here with you. We stayed like that as I prepared to leave for the day. The weight of the past no longer felt so heavy, and the uncertainty of the future didn't feel so daunting. All that mattered was the here and now, and the quiet promise of what was to come. I still feel good about what I did. Helping someone who needed to connect is what we do, don't we? Well, whatever he needs.